This old railroad bridge over the Missouri River is a landmark on the longest rail trail system in the United States, Missouri's 240-mile-long Katy Trail State Park. But the bridge's history is more complicated than most visitors realize. Did you realize this is the third bridge built on this site? And why was it built here in Boonville instead of somewhere else? Oh, and why can't you ride all the way across?
The Missouri, Kansas, and Texas Railroad was just that, a line built to connect the Texas Gulf Coast with the plains. Its original northern terminus was in Sedalia, Missouri, where a connection with the cross-state Missouri Pacific Railroad gave it access to St. Louis and points east, at least in theory. But the Katy, as the railroad was commonly known from its initials, faced a serious problem. The Missouri Pacific's ownership was hostile to the Katy and was not particularly interested in cooperatively forwarding Katy freight or passengers east. Why? Among other reasons, that ownership also controlled the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad, a rival line running southwest from St. Louis. Why earn a small amount of shipping fees from Sedalia to St. Louis over the Missouri Pacific when, if you could cripple the Katy, you could redirect that traffic over the Atlantic and Pacific? The full situation was far too complex for this video, but it was typical of the railroad wars of this era. If the Katy couldn't work with the Missouri Pacific, it would have to work against it. So by 1871, the railroad was considering building a new line north from Sedalia, crossing the Missouri River and heading northeast toward Chicago, bypassing both rival railroads and St. Louis entirely. The original idea was just a threat, intended to force the Missouri Pacific to cooperate, but the vision soon took on real promise. As one advisor to the Katy said, "There is but one solution to this trouble for the MK&T, and that is to go right ahead and build to Fayette or Moberly. This will bring the Missouri Pacific to their knees." But where would the railroad cross the miles-wide Missouri River Valley, which sat hundreds of feet below the surrounding plains and was often lined by sheer bedrock bluffs? Let's look at the terrain along potential routes. If you wanted to build a railroad between Sedalia and Fayette, where would you do it? Lying in your path are the deeply incised valleys of the Lamine and Blackwater Rivers and Muddy Creek, requiring lots of grades and bridges. If you try to skirt these to the west on higher ground, you go pretty far out of your way. So the Katy decided to head east-northeast across relatively gentle terrain and build one bridge across the Lamine, where its valley isn't quite so rugged. Once across, there's a ridge of high ground leading in a gentle curve all the way to the Missouri River. And right at a good crossing point sat the old river port of Boonville. It was perhaps icing on the cake that the Missouri Pacific controlled an older branch line running up to Boonville, and by choosing this route, the Katy could give its rival another poke in the eye. And once across the river, there is an easy route up the gentler terrain of northern Missouri, through Fayette and beyond. Every day is telling fearfully against us. Our only course lies in going to Boonville with all the speed we can put on. The Katy's first Missouri River Bridge was completed in January 1874, 6 months before the famous Eads Bridge across the Mississippi River at St. Louis. But it wasn't the bridge you see today. This one was a pivot span or swing bridge, with its central span rotating 90 degrees to open a navigation channel. Notice the massive piers built of locally quarried limestone, and the transition between the single piers supporting the pivot span and the double piers supporting the north end of the bridge. Despite being an impressive feat of engineering for its time, this first bridge didn't last long. Only 10 years later, the original post-truss design had to be strengthened as rapidly increasing train weights and lengths outgrew its design limits. Even that upgrade couldn't keep up with increasing train weights, and in 1896 the original superstructure was completely replaced with a more modern design, though the original foundations were retained. In this wonderful view from upriver, you can see the original post-truss design still in place from the pivot span south, and 4 newer spans nearly finished to the north. The second version, with its elegant spacious trusses, retained the pivot span design, its central span still rotating to allow river traffic to pass. Note that the original cut stone piers are still in place. This bridge served the railroad well, outlasting major floods like this one in 1903, which filled much of the 2.5-mile wide river valley. Notice the passenger train for scale, and the distinct shape of the pivot span with its central control house, which reminds me of a large bird spreading its wings. But by the 1920s, the original stone piers were starting to show degradation from 50 years of battering by water and ice and ever-increasing train loads. In 1932, the Katy completed an entirely new bridge, foundations and all, just downriver of the original site. This was built as a lifting drawbridge rather than the old pivot bridge, with winch towers poised to raise the lift deck as needed, allowing river traffic passage underneath. Ironically, though the original purpose of the Boonville Bridge was to bypass St. Louis in favor of Chicago, that connection never really panned out for the Katy. In the mid-1890s, around the same time it was rebuilding the original bridge to version 2, it turned its focus back to St. Louis. At Franklin, just north of the bridge, the railroad started building a new line east along the north side of the Missouri River Valley, entering into direct competition with the Missouri Pacific's line along the south side toward St. Louis. This line eventually captured most Katy traffic, while the original line to the north increasingly became a secondary route of lower importance. Adding to the irony, around this time the Missouri Pacific built its own new line through Boonville in several stages, eventually paralleling the Katy's new line on the other side of the river. Seems that neither railroad could make up its mind. The third bridge faithfully carried Katy Railroad traffic until the last train crossed in 1986. Missouri State Parks moved quickly to acquire the railroad's right-of-way, and over time the Katy Trail expanded to its current 240-mile length, with other branches both existing and planned. But why can't you ride across the Boonville Bridge today? The lift span is currently locked in its raised position, so even though the short southern span is open to that point, to actually cross the river, riders have to detour onto the nearby highway bridge. The full story is too complicated to explain here, but essentially there's a conflict between a mandate to maintain the river channel for navigation and the desire to put the bridge back into service for cyclists. Groups like the Katy Bridge Coalition succeeded in a long fight to save the bridge from demolition, and now dream of restoring the bridge to full lift operation, allowing both river and trail traffic to pass. But no clear headway has been made beyond renovating the southern span. To us, an alternate solution might be to follow the approach used in Little Rock, Arkansas, to renovate a similar railroad lift bridge across the Arkansas River into a downtown pedestrian crossing. The Junction Bridge's lift span is also locked in the raised position for river traffic, but pedestrian access is granted by elevator and stair towers on either side of the lift span. Crossing the raised span provides a glorious view of downtown Little Rock and the Arkansas River Valley, and the bridge anchors a beautiful riverfront park centered on the very site where a prominent outcrop gave Little Rock its name.
If my home state can achieve this, surely my adopted one can too.
Today, Boonville hosts a beautiful restored MK&T depot and a trailside museum full of exhibits telling the region's story as a transportation center for overland, river, and rail traffic. Meanwhile, the bridge remains a great place to watch the river flowing by. And, if you're lucky, some railroad action on the old Missouri Pacific, now Union Pacific, rail line along the river. The bridge is still standing strong through major floods and severe droughts, ready to return to service if we'll let it.